Okay, so I wanted to add my 2 cents to the force the vote conversation. I've listened to both sides of the debate and have come away with the conclusion that it was a bad strategy, to begin with. What surprises me is that it wasn't just people like Jimmy Dore making this argument, but also progressives that I generally take seriously. So I want to explain why I think it was a bad strategy. Not just because I believe it was a bad strategy, but because Jimmy Dore is going further and accusing those who disagree with him as being sellouts. That accusation rests on the assumption that this is a good strategy, to begin with. So I will demonstrate the various flaws of this strategy, and why it's more of a terrible checkers move that's doomed to fail and get nowhere, and hence, why it makes no sense to call those who disagree with said strategy and/or refuse to execute it a phony or a sellout. Again, it's one thing to simply disagree on strategy. It's another to actually label those who disagree as phonies and sellouts. On an emotional level, I get the passion behind the push for this. People really are suffering, and as is often pointed out, we are in the middle of a pandemic. However, all of the emotions in the world won't change the facts on the ground. And the alleged merits of force the vote are based on some bad data and logical fallacies being repeated by people who should know better. I'm guessing this is why Jimmy Dore won't debate Sam Seder on this topic. He is afraid to have his feet held to the fire. It's also why Kyle Kulinski appears to only have these conversations with people who agree with him. But before we get started, don't forget to click or tap the subscribe button and notification bell icon. Are you ready?
Here we go!
Myth number 1, force the vote is a brilliant strategy. The proponents of FTV have made a case as to why they think this was such a slam dunk strategy to implement. The remaining myths are the alleged reasons behind this thinking. I will explain why those reasons are actually myths. Now, when I explain to progressives the flaws behind all of this reasoning, the fallback position is always the same. It goes something like this: but Medicare for all is so important. We should fight for it. If that's your position, then fine, just say that to begin with. But understand that these are two very different points. People like Jimmy Dore weren't selling this as some doomed to fail brawl that would get us nowhere but was worth executing because M4A is important and worth fighting for. He and the other usual suspects were selling as some brilliant 4D chess strategy whose merits were so obvious that the only reason AOC wouldn't pursue this was that she was a phony. This was his proof that she was keeping you from healthcare. So let's proceed to the second myth. Myth number 2, that AOC and the squad members could have actually forced the vote. The entire premise here was that AOC and other progressive House members could have bent Pelosi to their will, by withholding their vote. But what was to stop Pelosi from simply making a deal with certain Republicans and recouping those lost votes? If you really believe there is so little difference between Republicans and the so-called corporate Democrats, then you have to admit this possibility. If you don't think this is possible, then you have to admit the wide chasm between the GOP and even corporate Democrats like Nancy Pelosi. Myth number 3, the American public is on board with Medicare for all. This is the biggest myth that gets repeated in progressive circles, and it's being peddled by people who should know better. The fact is that Medicare for all means different things to different people. When polled, the majority of those in favor of Medicare for all think they'd be able to keep their private insurance. On top of that, more Democrats favor building on top of the ACA, as Joe Biden has planned to do, than scrapping it and starting over. On top of that, 86% of those with employer coverage health insurance report being happy with their coverage. Once you begin unpacking what's actually involved with implementing what progressives call Medicare for all, especially the dismantling of private health insurance, you'll find that most Americans are not on board, and that's before seeing Republican attack ads. To be clear, I am fine with Medicare for all. I'm not 100% sold on the idea that it's the best solution, but it's certainly better than what we have now, better than anything the GOP is proposing, and is probably the only solution in the long run anyhow. But I recognize that there are tens of millions of Americans with a different view and a Senate that won't pass the bill. The fallback position I often hear is, yeah, but it's incumbent upon us progressives to educate the American public. My response to that is once again, okay fine, but say that to begin with. Arguing that we should force the vote for Medicare for all because America already wants it, is not the same as arguing that we should do it so that we can then get it onto the national debate stage and hopefully convince Americans to want something most of them don't want. Myth number 4, you either force the vote or you do nothing. This classic case of the either-or fallacy ignores the possibility of expanding the ACA by adding a public option, which Joe Biden ran on. Unlike Medicare for all, the public option has an actual chance of passing, and it could potentially morph into Medicare for all plans progressive long for. If public health insurance really is a better option than its private sector counterpart, and I believe it is, Then let the public option demonstrate the value of Medicare for all. Perhaps over time, the public option will simply put private health insurance out of business and we'll have single-payer healthcare. Myth number 5, if I can say it on Twitter, it must be true. I've come across countless platitudes that are apparently supposed to prove the value of FTV. Some examples include phrases like, "You don't think they'll pass Medicare for all in the middle of a pandemic?" Or, "You think people are happy with their private health insurance?" And the answer is no. I don't think the GOP will allow Medicare for all to pass simply because we're in the middle of a pandemic, because it doesn't follow that they would. Many of their constituents are well off and are well covered with private insurance, and many of those who aren't, don't believe we're in a real pandemic. Polls show that many do report being satisfied with their insurance, and even if they're not, it doesn't follow that they'll be happy to be forced into a public version. In fact, many of those people blame the government for the lack of quality and options in their private insurance. You have to understand how people outside of your bubble think. Myth number 6, Medicare for all is the only solution. Progressives seem to think that Medicare for all is the only viable solution. The reality is that Medicare for all is the exception to the rule among other advanced OECD nations. There are other ways of providing universal coverage, but the push for M4A has become more like an article of faith among certain progressives. Myth number 7, this will flush out the Democrats who were just faking support for Medicare for all. So the alleged strategy here is that this will separate the wheat from the chaff. That there were Democrats who were simply feigning support for Medicare for all, but now that it comes down to an actual vote, they'll have to put their money where their mouths are. How this is the case isn't clear. What's the difference between signing up to support M4A and voting for it in the form of a bill that has no chance of passing? And keep in mind, this is the insanity that people like Jimmy Dore were expecting AOC to prioritize during the fight to get stimulus checks and hopefully increase said stimulus checks to $2,000. Not to mention the fight to retake the Senate. Myth number 8, what we've tried so far hasn't brought us Medicare for all, so we should try forcing the vote. Okay, so this is more of a logical fallacy than a myth. So putting aside for a moment the fact that most Americans don't want what progressives are calling Medicare for all, this is like arguing that, because we haven't been able to send an astronaut to Mars, we should therefore try catapulting one there. No. We haven't passed Medicare for all because the majority of Americans don't want it, at least not yet, and we don't have the votes for it, at least not yet. Forcing the vote early won't change that.